My name is Marisa Novara. I'm a vice president here at the Metropolitan Planning Council. MPC is a planning and policy change organization. We were founded in 1934, and our first executive director was a woman named Elizabeth Wood. Elizabeth Wood went on to be the first director of the Chicago Housing Authority, where she later left in protest when her efforts to establish integrated public housing were met with organized institutional roadblocks and threats of public violence. So our ties to fair housing and equity run very deep in this organization, and we're so pleased to be able to partner today with the Woods Fund Chicago and Polk Brothers Foundation to shine a light on this important both historical and ongoing practice, and most importantly, what we can be doing about it today. I'd like to recognize the Woods Fund and Polk Brothers Foundation for their generous support, their sponsorship of this event, and commitment to this issue. I would like to recognize Grace Ho, president of the Woods Fund, who's here today, Karenina Grimble and Deborah Bennett for their partnership in putting together today's event. You will hear from both of them later in the program. You'll also hear from my colleague Lynette McCrae, who I thank for all of her work in organizing this event, and all of the many speakers who are here to talk through this with you. I also want to note that for many of us in this room, there's a special labor of love that's kind of going on here under the surface. And that is, for many of us, our shared ties to a West Side neighborhood called North Lawndale. North Lawndale, of course, was not the only neighborhood in which African Americans were systematically stripped of their wealth through the exploitative process called contract for deed or contract selling, but it was in many ways the epicenter of that practice. And it feels to me in many ways that neighborhood itself is really a presence in the room today. And when I look around at all of the people that are here, I see so many connections to that. So one of our organizers and presenters, Karenina Grimble, has lived in the community for almost 20 years. I lived and worked there for over a decade. That's where I met Lynette McCrae, who was there as an intern. Matt Cole worked in the North Lawndale Neighborhood Housing Services office for more than 6 years. And of course, two of our speakers, Beryl Satter and Jack McNamara, go back as long as anyone in this room with their commitment to and work on issues in this community. And finally, there is one actual bit of North Lawndale history present here today, and that is all thanks to Blanche Suggs Killingsworth of the North Lawndale Office of Neighborhood Housing Services. So Miss Blanche, as I've always called her, she's a longtime colleague, friend, and neighborhood champion. She's president of the North Lawndale Historical and Cultural Society, and we have her to thank for the boards that are located in the lobby. And if you didn't get a chance to walk through those before the event, please take a moment to do that during the break or after the break, and really absorb the history that's so carefully documented there. And there's a lot of really important and great people that helped with that effort, including other folks in the room like Matt and Jack, the late and very missed Dr. Charles Leeks, and others who helped with that effort. So, Ms. Blanche, if you could just stand and be recognized for your commitment to the community. Thank you. And I now turn to my colleague, Lynette McCrae, who will set the stage for the rest of the morning. Thanks.
Hello again, everyone, and welcome. Thank you all so much for being here. Here at MPC, back in March, we released a report on the cost of segregation. And it highlighted key findings about what we as a region pay in terms of lost lives, lost incomes, and lost potential due to our levels of economic and racial segregation. So since the release, we've been engaging in conversations with diverse partners across the region, including many of you here in this room, to get your thoughts on what are some of the strategies that we should be looking at in order to address these challenges of segregation and inequity in our region. And these challenges of segregation and inequity really set the backdrop for the conversation that we're having today on contract buying. As we know, local and federal policy conspired to really create the circumstances that excluded African Americans from homeownership, from access to credit in the 1930s and 1960s. And in that vacuum, in those circumstances, contract sellers came in and seized the opportunity to really look for ways to sell homes to families under predatory terms and take advantage of the situation. So this process of contract buying is sometimes referred to in different ways. So you may hear folks today talk about it as land contracts, installment contracts, contracts for deeds. There are a number of different ways that it's referred to, but I think it's important that we understand that this is a practice that has evolved over time as economics and as policy has changed in this country and here locally. But we know that the challenges of segregation and inequity continue to persist today, as does this practice. And that's why we're here. And these same communities that were impacted and targeted when contract buying first found its roots here in Chicago, these are the same communities of color that continue to be preyed on by this practice today. So I am really pleased that this topic has drawn the attention that it has. But at the same time, I think it's drawn this level of attention because we realize that this is still very much an issue that plagues us and that we as a region still need to grapple with, and really even nationally, because this isn't just a Chicago issue. This is something that we see happening in other states across the country as well. So we're here to really to hear from our esteemed panelists today from their unique perspectives on this issue, both as folks who have literally written the book on contract buying, to home buyers who are dealing with this issue today. So we're excited that we have this range of voices that can represent not only some of the history and the challenges associated with this issue, but I think most importantly to help move us to some constructive conversation about what can we be doing to address this through our individual roles and hopefully collectively. So with that, I just want to walk us through the day, how we'll flow. We'll have 3 sets of panels. Our first set of panels will talk about the history of contract buying. We'll follow that with a second panel that will feature a discussion of contract buying as it exists today. And we'll hear from present-day contract buyers about their experiences. And finally, we'll have a panel of experts who will be discussing solutions, what's currently being done here locally, at the regional level, and at the federal level to address this issue, and to hear from you about what you're doing and what more needs to be done. So my hope for today is that we leave with some better understanding around this, and again, to have some tangible solutions that we can all walk out of this room understanding what we can be doing. So I will be welcoming our first panel, but I do want to acknowledge our online viewers. For those of you that couldn't be here with us today, we thank you so much for tuning in. We're webcasting live, and we'll also be having this available afterwards for those of you that want to share. We have a hashtag for those who are listening and who may want to tweet, hashtag MPC Forum. So if you have questions along the way, please feel free to tweet those using that hashtag, and any questions that you have to @MetroPlanners, and we'll be taking questions from the audience throughout as well as from our online viewers. And I'll also mention the restrooms really quickly. So the men's room is just out the main entrance to my right, your left, the ladies to my left, your right. We'll have a short break after our first panel, but obviously feel free to use the restroom and refresh your drinks as you need to. So with that, I would like to welcome our first set of panelists. We'll have Alden Lurie, who is our Director of Research and Evaluation here at MPC, and Beryl Satter, who is the author of Family Properties: How the Struggle Over Race and Real Estate Transformed Chicago and Urban America. Please welcome them.
Okay, so I'm gonna leave a seat in between us here so we don't have to crane our necks too bad. Okay. I'm sorry, Lynette, I should have been here early enough to do a walkthrough here. Testing. Nope. Testing, there we go. All right. So Alden Lowry, Director of Research and Evaluation here, and Beryl Satter. Beryl, thanks so much for being with us this morning.
Thank you for inviting me. Let's see if I can get this on.
Yeah, I think push up there.
Got it. Thank you.
Might take a second.
Hello?
There you
Okay,
go.
it's
Okay.
working.
So there is a lot of excitement about today, but a lot of excitement in particular about you and family properties, in case you guys have not had a chance to indulge. And just a tiny bit of pleasantries. So, you know, there was a lot of interest in this in the tickets today. So much so that we had people clamoring. We had a waiting list. We had people calling, trying to barter and bargain their way into some seats. Shout out to Lynette Stuhlmacher, who is, I don't believe in the room, but was one of those people who was really trying avidly to get seats for some of her students at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. So a lot of excitement about today, about your presence and the issue. But family properties is not just about contract buying. And in the opening session, my hope is that we will give people certainly an understanding of what happened and what went on, but that we will also talk about what I would say are some of the underlying issues that you really surface in your book that I think explain why this became such an issue, not just in Chicago, but across the country, and why we've seen other forms of this kind of economic oppression, if you will, from the issues with the unbanked, from predatory lending to issues in terms of the lack of recovery, particularly in African American neighborhoods like North Lawndale after the recession. There are a lot of things that are kind of the underpinnings of those phenomena, which was also part of contract buying, and I think you touched on them: issues of race, issues of segregation, the pursuit of the American dream, so on and so forth. So anyhow, so let's dive right in. If you can, for those of us who are not very familiar with contract buying, what is contract buying? What did you discover in following your father's work?
Okay, so the underlying basis for all these problems was federal policy that kept black people from the same credit access that white people had. Now, so the basis that most of you, probably everyone knows, but maybe not, so just in case, starting in the 1930s, 1934, with the creation of the Federal Housing Administration, was a program created in the New Deal to help jumpstart the construction industry, the housing construction industry, which had tanked in the Depression. And the idea was that the government would insure loans to builders or to purchasers so that homes could be built or purchased. However, if the government is going to insure loans, first they want to appraise. And in the 1930s, the white appraisal industry was thoroughly racist, overtly so, no shame about it, completely open, and they put their ideas about how to appraise property, made it into federal housing manuals, which stated that if a neighborhood had, a white neighborhood had any black residents, that neighborhood was devalued and you should not insure there. So if a black person wanted to buy a property in a white area, they would say no because your presence will devalue the property there, so we can't insure the loan. If the government wouldn't insure the loan, banks wouldn't insure it. You couldn't buy. If black people wanted to buy property in a black neighborhood, they also couldn't do it, generally because the FHA didn't like to insure in urban, overcrowded areas, which were areas that black people were living in part because they were their neighborhoods were zoned for industry and things like that, and they were kept out of new developments. So you couldn't move out and you couldn't get a loan if you stayed. Now, in that context, which is national, all kinds of different methods arose to take advantage of black people's desperate need for housing. Like anyone, they need housing, but they especially needed housing after the Great Migration. You had millions of African Americans starting in the 1890s, but picking up after World War I and then more after World War II, fleeing the South and moving to northern cities where there were jobs. There were jobs, but there was no housing. They couldn't get credit to buy homes. So what contract selling was a method to circumvent that problem of that you can't get a mortgage to get a house. So contract sellers were private individuals who would buy a house or an apartment from usually a white person with borrowed money, and then sell it to a black buyer, usually for double what they paid, often up to quadruple, and sell it to them on basically on an installment plan, which meant that the black buyer would give a down payment, be responsible for taxes, insurance, and maintenance, in interest, and then pay off the rest, which was usually, again, double to quadruple what their seller had paid over a 30-year period, say. But they're paying the seller, not a bank. And the seller has all the equity in the house. The seller has all the rights. And if the buyer missed one payment, it was in these contracts that they could repossess the property. So this was a way to move around the mortgage block. And it was one of the only ways to do it. So in Chicago, which had a black population of almost 1 million people by the early 60s, there were estimates that 80% of the housing that they purchased was bought on contract. Again, sort of routinely at double to quadruple what whites were paying. And because you're paying so much, the likelihood of missing and often facing job discrimination as well, so you're earning less and paying way more, the chances of missing a payment were fairly high. If you did miss, you get thrown out immediately, and the house would be resold. And you had cases. My father was an attorney who represented contract buyers, the people who are buying. And he had clients who had paid $8,500 of a $9,000 contract, and then were thrown out. And then when he investigated, he found that the contract seller had paid $3,000 for the house. So he buys it for $3,000, sells it for $9,000, collects $8,500, and throws you out and does it again. Or they can do it earlier. But it causes, havoc. And another thing that's important about it is that contract selling, you had none of the protections that you had with a mortgage. So if you fall behind on your mortgage payments and you go into foreclosure, it's expensive to initiate the foreclosure process. You get to keep whatever equity you already put into the property. There's all kinds of protections for you. But if you fell behind on a contract, the cost of initiating proceedings was $4.50. It was like the same as it would be for a renter. That was in the 50s, so it was more money now, but not much more. It was very little. It was very easy, and all the laws were stacked to make it extremely easy to repossess and very difficult to get ownership.
Now, in terms of thinking about the magnitude of how widespread this was, that 85% number. So, I mean, this was the way black people were able to buy homes, in Chicago and other places. It also sounded like a way for there to be a very significant transfer of wealth. Mm-hmm. And if you can talk a little bit about that aspect of this and what the magnitude of that was.
Right. Well, the transfer of wealth was from black communities to white speculators who were buying up massive amounts of property, whole 8-block areas, 12-block areas. And they would buy it from white people who they would sort of scare into leaving by saying, if you don't sell to me right now, your house is worth $10,000, I'll give you $10,000 today, but if you don't sell to me now, I'll come back in a few weeks and I'll give you $9,000. And if you want to wait a month, fine, I'll give you $8,000, et cetera. So, the white people who were in these communities felt pressure to leave and felt that they were losing money. However, they were paid in cash for, they were bought out. And they could move to a suburb which was open to them and they could buy a new place. But the black people who were moving in did not have the same credit access. They were buying on contract. If they wanted to leave, it means leaving behind everything. So this transfer of wealth is one that, of course, the contract sellers are making huge amounts of money. But they would also sell these contracts that were worth, say you have a house and you've bought it for $10,000 and you sell it for $25,000, and you collect a down payment that's double what you borrowed the money for, and you collect all this money and you've made more than enough. So then you sell it to some white dentist or somebody, or a lawyer, or, they would sell their contracts to other people for just maybe 22,000. They or 20,000. It was worth 24. And those people would profit, and the profit spread. Now, my father was an attorney who represented, again, the clients. His clients were black buyers, and he calculated between the price markups and the interest they were paying and everything else that in 1958 he estimated $1 million a day being drained out of black communities. That would be about $8 million a day now. And other studies were done. The Urban League did one, and they said, no, it's really $500,000 a day, And it was hard to get an exact figure, but there's no question it was, if you want to split the difference, $750,000 a day? It's a lot of money every day, for people who are already pushed. And it's money that could have obviously gone to all kinds of education, upkeep, things that they could not do, things they had to sacrifice in order to keep up with these predatory contracts.
Those are jaw-dropping figures, and when you consider that we're talking about North Lawndale and East Garfield Park and West Garfield Park and Auburn Gresham and Woodlawn and Roseland and all of these other neighborhoods. I mean, essentially during this period of time, the city's south and west sides were changing dramatically and changing very quickly. And underneath that change was this hidden but profound kind of economic devastation. You spoke to the precarious situation that the contract buyers were in amidst payment. Can you give us a description of what the scene could be like in a typical black neighborhood or changing black neighborhood in Chicago? I mean, are we talking about literally walking down the block and seeing possessions on the front lawn from people being essentially kind of evicted?
No, not initially. The really interesting thing about this is that by the late 50s, early 60s, black medium income and white medium income in Chicago was not that far apart. So people were, the average was very close. So they had an income, it's just that their expenses were so much higher, And so instead of, seeing people dispossessed on the street, you would see, a black family, a husband and a wife, where, in a white family, maybe only the husband would need to work. They're paying double a black family, so the husband and wife both work, And so usually they would try to make do by everyone in the household, all adults working, sometimes taking double jobs, or subletting their apartments, or cramming in extra tenants. Often they would be shown an apartment and told, look, it's going to cost you this much per month, but see, there's a wall here, and you rent out this half, and you live in this house, and it's fine. So you will easily make that money. They would not be told that these subdivisions were actually illegal, and they could be charged, hundreds of dollars a day for a fine for this. And sometimes the code violations, were ignored, and sometimes not. But what they would do is just work harder, everyone work, subdivide the apartment, bring in extra tenants, and try to make it. So the effect was not people on the street as much as an overcrowding in these communities. They became, drastically overcrowded, but city services stayed the same or lessened. So the communities start to decline for that reason. The schools start to get grotesquely overcrowded, and the school district in the city of Chicago refused to allow people from black communities with their children to go to white schools that had empty seats. And there was huge battles over that. That was what first brought King actually to Chicago, with these school battles.
The Willis wagons and
Yeah, rather than let them go to nearby communities where there were room, they put in these vans in the schoolyards and taught the kids in there. I actually went to one when I was a kid. I was at O'Keefe in the South Side, and I remember going, sort of being puzzled at leaving kindergarten, being walked to the playground to go into a van for class, or for whatever it was. And it seemed, just unusual, I wonder why we're going and sitting in this weird place. So I do have a personal memory of that from the South Side. So, but the schools are overcrowded, the parents are working, they don't, it's harder to watch your kids. The white neighbors see, the garbage has not been collected. Suddenly, there's kids everywhere and there's no parents, and where are they? And it sort of magnified the white flight because the whites who had the option to leave could see something was going on but didn't know what, but they could see something's wrong in this community. The African Americans living there are struggling as hard as human beings can struggle, trying desperately to hold on. Many did, some didn't, but always at a massive cost to themselves, paying prices that they should not have had to pay. So I think that would be more what you would see as the crowds. It's only when people organized and stopped making their payments that you had evictions.
You talked a little bit about King Chicago movement, and the schools, I think, were a big part of the outreach that was made, and he had this ready-made kind of advocacy infrastructure, if you will, that kind of got behind his movement, which was primarily about housing. But one of the things that was born out of this crisis with contract buying was also this activism. And if you can talk a little bit about that, how did people fight this, and ultimately were there some victories?
Yes, sure. My father was a loan attorney who had these clients, and he would write articles in the Chicago Defender and talk about the $1 million a day cost of being black in Chicago. But he was kind of a lone wolf sort of person. He didn't really organize with others, and when he died in 1965, there wasn't really an organized movement about this, though there was a lot of knowledge about it. There was, of course, everyone in the black community knew about it. He was trying to bring this information to white people who were fairly indifferent. But in 1966, Monsignor Jack Egan, who was an activist priest who had worked with Saul Alinsky, was sent to Lawndale by his cardinal, sort of as a punishment. And because there were very few Catholics there, and they said, "We'll get him out of trouble. We'll go where there's no Catholics." And they sent him out there, and he decided to organize, that he would try to do an Alinsky-style organizing in Lawndale and have people go door to door and listen what people had to say. And so he brought in seminarians from all over Chicago to go door to door, made that his infrastructure, his organizing infrastructure. And among those seminarians was Jack McNamara, who we will be hearing from in the next panel. When Jack went door to door, he started to hear people say, I could make it, but, everyone in the family's working, I'm working, my mother's working, but we can't make these payments, they're too high. And then he went back to Jack Egan, who explained about contract selling. So at that point, when they began to hear that this was a problem, these organizers coming out of Presentation Parish brought together a small group of black buyers and people who were uncomfortable but willing to talk to each other about what had happened to them. And in that group was a woman named Ruth Wells, who had been bought a house for $13,000 and bought a house for $26,000 that she learned later had been purchased weeks before for $13,000, and she was willing to talk about what happened. Anyway, she became a leader. She got up first in front of a small group of neighbors and said, "I bought this way. I was ripped off. This is unfair. We need to do something." Soon. She made it possible for the others to discuss openly what went on. They then went door to door. Several African American buyers in Lawndale, Clyde Ross, Ruth Wells, and a few others, Henrietta Banks, and they went door to door, got people to talk about what was happening, and together they organized something called the Contract Buyers League. And this league decided they were going to pressure these the contract sellers, to renegotiate their contracts. And the idea was that this whole issue of mortgage redlining and the FHA and how the savings and loans are not loaning and these complicated contracts was just too difficult for people to organize around. But the Contract Buyers League showed that was absolutely not true. These were people they were middle-aged people. They had worked for 20 years. They were holding on to their houses, and they were very interested in following the money. And they did so. They organized. Soon they had They started from like a dozen people, and then ultimately had about 3,000 members. And they picketed the people who had sold them the property. They said, we want you to renegotiate these contracts at a markup of 15%, which we consider a fair profit, not 100 or 200%. And of course, they said no. The sellers said, no, we're not going to renegotiate. So then they went on a payment strike, and that's when you started to have evictions, because if you didn't make a payment, you could be thrown out. That was the law. So they organized a mass payment strike. And there were evictions. They ended up helping change the Illinois law about evictions, how easy it was. How it was biased against the tenants. They ended up collaborating with other organizations in Chicago to do the first truly systematic study of mortgage redlining, because they wanted to prove that they had no access to conventional mortgages. And in the late 60s, that had not been documented. So they worked with people to document that en masse. The documentation that they created ended up being part of a larger movement by National People's Action that led to the passage of the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act and the Community Reinvestment Act. Those are two federal laws from the 70s that, especially the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, was the first time that banks were forced to say where they were loaning. So they ended up having a national effect, and they also brought their contract sellers to court and fought that for 12 years. And this was a lot from a group of a community that even then was facing a lot of economic stresses. These were people that were quite denigrated in the culture as newcomers, as migrants. They're from Mississippi. What do they know? Even though, a lot of the conditions in the neighborhood were blamed on them and their culture, their supposed culture. Even though it's the same culture that is leading a massive civil rights movement in the South at the exact same time. But they pulled all this together. They were more sophisticated than, anything of their period in terms of trying to get at the real economic basis of the drainage of wealth from their community. So there's a lot of emphasis often on King coming to Chicago and his idea about fair housing, and we need to fight real estate steering, where you go to a real estate guy and he says, no, there's nothing here, you go there. But these people were looking at something that was more fundamental than that, which was that we can't get credit to buy anyway. And until I worked on this book, there was one 1972 article in the Atlantic about the contract buyers. There was and 2 dissertations, and that was all there was about them, which is so shocking considering how brilliant they were and how heroic.
I was going to say the book really kind of illuminated the issue in a way that hadn't been before, and the work from the Contract Buyers League and others in terms of the passage of HMDA. Mm-hmm. As a longtime journalist, I've used taking advantage of HMDA to take a look at mortgage lending. It's really opened the gate for a much closer look at the way lending happens. We're going to go to questions in just a moment, but I did want you to just talk briefly, if you can, but at least to some degree, about this also being a very personal story for you. And it's been great what it's done in terms of illuminating the issue, but what was this like for you? How has this journey been for you, and kind of connecting with your father, who you didn't know a whole lot about in terms of this work since he passed when you were a small child. But so what's this been like for Beryl, just to kind of
hugely interesting. I mentioned my father. He died very young, at the age of 49. I was 6 years old, the youngest of his 5 children, when he passed away, and he died in the middle of this fight. He had all these clients, and he had been written up in the paper quite a bit, especially the Chicago Daily News. Those people were, friends of his, or admirers, I guess. They were willing to publish him. The Tribune, on the other hand, attacked him. He passed away when I was so young that I hadn't heard much of. I didn't understand what he had done, and because the other part of the story that I tell in the book is that my father had properties in Lawndale. He had grown up there. He moved there when he married. Four of my siblings, all of them, were born in Lawndale, in West Garfield Park, what's now considered West Garfield Park. And he had these properties there, and he saw what was going on with these contract sellers. He saw what they were doing to the community, and he refused to sell his properties. The only ones who would buy were them, and he's like, I'm holding on, I don't care. And after his death, those properties were worth nothing. He had paid $50,000 each for them. My mother ended up selling them for $2,000 for like all of them, and felt she had to because she couldn't keep up the maintenance, and just as a widow with 5 kids, she couldn't handle it. And growing up in a family where there was sort of some talk about that my father had done something important in the city, but no one really wanted to praise him too much because he didn't leave the family with anything when he died, and my mother's family was not happy about that. So finding out this as an adult, what he'd actually done, was a healing thing, a powerful thing. It helped me sort of see that the way we grew up was part of a bigger story that had immense value, rather than just some bad luck. And so it was, it enabled me to know my own father, who I had not known, and find out, what his life had been devoted to in a detail that I had no hint of.
Well, we've all been enriched by you taking that journey. I think we should have some questions in the audience and perhaps online. So, sure.
I have a question. I have the Atlantic article here from 1972, which I've read. Mm-hmm. And in the article, it says that what brought this issue to a head for Ms. Wells was that she had found an opportunity to get a mortgage, and she went to the seller and Father McNamara is liberally mentioned in this article, so I'm sure he can clarify a lot. And he had added a $1,500 insurance charge,
Correct. Right.
which that started the ball rolling. She reluctantly challenged that. My question is, and also someone encouraged her to get an appraisal, and that's how she found out. She didn't know that the house was worth a little more than $13,000. So my question is, where did she find the opportunity to obtain a mortgage?
I don't know about that. I know that she wanted that Mo Foreman, who was the man who had sold her the property, suddenly added a big insurance charge to her out of the blue. Suddenly said she had to pay, $1,500 more, and that's when she went to Father Egan and Jack McNamara and said, "What is going on?" They helped her get the appraisal. Found out that 10 years after she purchased the house, that it was now appraised at $15,000 as opposed to the $13,000 that the man who had sold it to her had purchased her for, and she was still paying off, 10 grand more than that. I don't know where. I mean, there were, you could. Some of the contracts were organized such that after a certain number of years, you were then to go get a mortgage, and then often when you tried, you couldn't. So then you had to refinance somehow, But in '68, they were just starting to make some mortgages in some of these neighborhoods. The Fair Housing Act had been passed. There began to be some money, and in fact, there was a kind of a reversal, a negative reversal, where they passed amendment that gave mortgage money to black neighborhoods. They called them some like riot-prone areas or something, and they were guaranteed. But they were guaranteed 100%, and speculators took advantage of that as well. So I don't know the exact story of that. Maybe Jack McNamara, when he.
The reason I raise it is because the advent of historically black banks came into existence because of the redlining, and many of them, their major portfolio was to finance housing.
Right.
So I didn't know if there was a
Yeah,
connection to
no,
that.
I don't think so. I mean, there were just so few black banks relative to the population. Well, relative to the need, they couldn't possibly
I
take care
understand
of
that. I'm
everyone.
talking about
Yeah.
her specific need.
Yeah, I
You
don't
don't
know.
know.
I don't
Okay,
know.
thank you.
Okay, he's coming with a mic.
Hi. You said that they were making this very creative, multi-layered, convoluted contracts back in those days. Do you know when Illinois came up with the document, it's called Installment Contract for Warranty Deed in Illinois? Was that a result of these convoluted contracts, trying to cut it down on that?
You know, I don't know. I mean, the Articles of Agreement for Warranty Deed was the name of, was what was the legal name for a land contract. And they weren't that convoluted. They basically just didn't give you many rights. So, and the issue is in different states, they give the buyer different levels of rights. So in Illinois, they had very few rights. Some states said after you pay 20%, you have some right to this, some equity. Illinois did not. Illinois had some among the harshest penalties around not paying your contract. So by the time, I don't know when they reformed it, but it was certainly after the heyday of all this. And the heyday was in the 40s through the mid-60s. By the late 60s, it's ending because, again, of the Fair Housing Act and new methods of predatory lending that were more effective, maybe, even than the contract selling had been.
Thank you. Chris? Oh.
In the book you talk about, I forget if it's one or two different federal lawsuits that the contract buyers bring as a group against the landlords, kind of as a group. That ends up kind of petering out at the end of the lawsuits. Could you talk a little bit about if you have any sense of how that helped, how it didn't help?
I think, the lawsuits, in a way, they petered out, but that was also because many of the sellers settled with the buyers. So by the time, originally, the original suit, which was two suits, one on the west side and one on the south side, when they were originally launched in 1969, there was, like 100 people listed as defendants, all these savings and loans, all these different contract sellers. By the time it went to trial in the mid-70s, there were like 6 people still as defendants, and the rest had settled one way or another. So in a way, it petered out. In a way, the people did get, a lot of people had their contracts renegotiated. The average savings was about $14,000 per person, and so you multiply that by 8 for today's money. So in that sense, it was not a failure in that way, but it didn't. They wanted to set a legal precedent, and they were not able to. They wanted to use a 1968 Supreme Court ruling in Jones versus Meyer that said that if a black person's dollar is worth less than a white person's dollar, then we haven't really abolished slavery, because being free means that you could participate in an equal way in the economy. It doesn't just mean that you're not owned. So this was a very important ruling that very few people paid attention to, but the attorneys who brought the suit were building on that to say that their rights had been violated because they were forced into these contracts that made their money worth way less because they had to pay so much more. And that they did not succeed. That would have been a wonderfully radical and great thing because black people are overcharged in so many ways, in a systematic manner. And they were trying to get it something bigger. So that did not work. What did work was there was benefit to individual members, and there was the benefit to the country, and that the work that was done to support the case, again, helped document redlining. So, it's one of these mixed things where They didn't win the case, but they won some other battles. And why they didn't win the case is, shocking in itself. The nature of the jurors and what they thought, and of the judges. I mean, it's always a crapshoot with cases like this. But I think it's more mixed, and I don't think it should be seen as it failed and not worth doing, because it clearly was. It as much for what it revealed for anything else.
Any other questions? I got a couple I can throw in to help move us along. Anything online or?
I don't think so. Maybe one more.
One of the things I'm curious about, and in some of the reporting I've done around subprime lending, and the thought, one of the revelations that when we looked at it here in Chicago was that you had African Americans seemingly savvy enough, educated enough to know a bad deal, who were still taking subprime loans. And one of the things that we heard in that reporting was that there just weren't very many options, and that there was also almost kind of this pathology about chasing this dream, this dream of being a homeowner, and how can I do that, and the desire to get there, and then just wanting to hear a yes. And the only place you're hearing a yes is from people who are giving you, admittedly and knowingly, a bad deal, but you want the deal so badly. In the sense of your understanding of kind of the thought process for many of the contract buyers, what were some of the reasons why folks were taking these deals?
In the 60s and 50s, there was no other choice, and they were not. It wasn't a matter of lack of sophistication. Many of these people went to bank after bank after bank. Clyde Ross went to several banks. He was one of the organizers of the Contract Buyers League later. He went to bank after bank and was insulted, ignored, and turned down repeatedly. So it's not like they didn't know how to do it. They did everything they could. They couldn't get a loan. He wanted to move out of a crowded area. These people were moving so that they could have better schools for their kids and better housing. I mean, it looked like the right way to go. The choice was to remain doubled up with family members. Some of these areas where, people who moved to Lawndale had lived before were being condemned for highway construction, so they had to move. You have to move somehow. And this way, at least it seemed like there was a chance. So I don't think it in any way was a lack of sophistication. They knew it was one of the only ways to buy. And they just figured, we work hard, we'll manage it. And I think, in terms of, is there something wrong with wanting to buy a home? I mean, my father bought properties so that he could have some security for his family. He had a heart ailment, which is why he died so young, and he knew he might not work forever, and so he thought, if I own these properties, my family might be okay. Generations after generations of people have done that, immigrants and others, they move, they buy a two-flat, so they could manage. So, it would have taken a lot of imagination to think of another way to build wealth. This is the number one way that Americans build wealth. So they were trying to follow the rules in any way they could, and the rules were stacked against them, but they thought they could overcome that. And so in the court cases that the trial records that I have from my father's cases, the people will question, how did you do this? Why did you do this? And also I interviewed some of them, and they said, we looked at each other, we said, it's going to be tough. Do you think we could handle it? Let's just give it a shot. We're both working, that kind of thing. So I wouldn't call it naivete at all back then. And even now, of course, Americans across all types of Americans got subprime loans. I mean, what happened was the method of selling people a house with an adjustable rate mortgage that would start with a low rate and then balloon way up was, laws enabled that to happen first. So then it became legal. Then, a lot of these kinds of laws started in black communities and with refinancing loans. And once these mortgage companies realized how profitable it was, it sort of spilled out into the broader society. So everyone did it because everyone believed that housing was just going to keep getting more valuable, and because in some cases those were the only loans available. So black people were steered to these loans. We know that a black wage earner earning identical to a white wage earner with the same credit was 3 times as likely to be getting a subprime loan than not. And the problem is, we tend to think that when you go to a broker that they're going to treat you fairly. Most of us don't go in assuming that they're going to, do everything they can to exploit us. But the rules were set up such that the incentives were set up so that they would do that, that they would try to exploit you. And I think that is the much bigger problem than, we can't all be experts on real estate transactions. And at some point, that is why you hire a lawyer. In the 60s, a lot of these lawyers were in league with the sellers or were selling property themselves. And so even if you tried to take steps to protect yourself, all the professionals around you were vultures who were trying to hurt you. And I don't know if that really changed, in the early 2000s, where the appraiser was working for the mortgage company, so he had she had every reason to overvalue the house. That
everybody was part of the deal.
Yeah, they're all in on it in some way, and the money is again funneling upwards this time to Wall Street. That is, the groups that are buying mortgage-backed securities, that they want the absolute highest possible interest rate to sell to their investors. This was the second time around, it's a massive scheme with, whole nations involved. And I don't think you can fault people for believing that if they can get a hold of a piece of property, it will help them, because it historically has helped, and for many people, it works.
All right. Well, I think we've got another hand, but do we have time to squeeze one more question in? No?
We probably need to keep going. We can take a break, and maybe if you want to catch Beryl during the break, that might be an option. So please join me in thanking Beryl Satter and Alden Lurie. And really helping us set the stage for the rest of our conversations. We are going to take a short break. I would encourage you all to take a look in the back. We've got some copies of some contracts for deed that I think Ms. Blanche brought, so you all can take a look at some of those. Obviously, please take a look at the exhibit in the hallway, and we'll be joining back here to get started with our next panel, which will feature current folks that are working on this issue at 9:35. So see you soon. So what we have before us now is a group of panelists who are going to talk from their perspective, their present day perspective on this issue. We are joined by our moderator, Karenina Grimble from Woods Fund, Chicago. We have Jack McNamara, who you heard referenced on our earlier panel, and I'm sure many of you in this room know through his work as the lead organizer with the Contract Buyers League. We also have Ms. Karen Edwards, who's a current homeowner, and I want to extend a very special thank you to her for being here to share her story with us today. And so we will also likely be joined by another homeowner. Her name is Leisha Conrad. She's actually running here to join us after working a shift at her job. So she may be joining us a little late, but we'll welcome her when she comes. So with that, I'll turn it over to our moderator, Karenina. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we have a lot of information to share with you. We're gonna jump right in. My bio and Jack's bio are in your programs. And Karen is going to be able to share her story with you. And I echo Lynette's thanks and gratefulness that you were here to talk with us today. So Karen Edwards signed her contract. You signed the contract on your home in 2013. And you just recently found out that what you thought was a mortgage was actually a contract. Right. So a couple of questions about that. So is this your first time buying a home?
No, it's actually my second time. My first home was a rent-to-own home, and I purchased that home with my husband at that time. And the home got foreclosed on because I was going through a very bad divorce with the husband. I had to have hand surgery. My mom had just had a heart attack, so she had to have open heart surgery as well as carotid artery surgery. And I'm going through all this within a year's time. And I'm also trying to go back to work at the same time to pay bills on a weekly basis. How I came across the home that I have now from the people that I'm currently paying, I can't even say a mortgage to because it's really not a mortgage, who I'm paying money to. I'll just put it that way. I actually came across them from my next door neighbor. I guess he called himself trying to be helpful by explaining to people that my situation. So when I came across the people, am I allowed to say who they are?
I don't know. Can she say who they are, Jack? Sure.
The name of the company is called URB. Yes. URB has had so many different names. When I first found out about URB, let me go back a little bit. When I first found out about URB, my next door neighbor from the property that got foreclosed on, he says that he has a friend that works for URB that could help me out in the situation to getting a mortgage so I can, have some place to live with my mom when she gets out the hospital.
Because your locks were being changed on the home that was being foreclosed on.
Yes, the locks were being changed when I was standing there from during the foreclosure. So from that, I had to have somewhere to move to. I just couldn't have my mom, who's getting ready to come out the hospital, to live in the shelter or on the streets. I just couldn't do that. So what I did was I went over to URB. Well, my neighbor, he drove me down to the URB office and over on Torrance and Cicero and Lincolnwood, same place. Sat down with them, explained to them my situation. I was going through a divorce and everything of that nature. I was very forthcoming with them, telling them the absolute truth about myself. They were not truthful with me at all. Didn't find out that URB was not a good company to do business with. I was in the house for about a good 4 or 5 months. They said that everything in the house was brand new, which it was not. Refrigerator conked out about a month and a half after I got in there. The stove conked out. I had to heat the house up the old-fashioned way using heaters in every room. Sorry.
Jack, I'm going to ask you a question, and maybe you can. Thank you. Begin to talk with us some about what you see as the similarities and the differences between contract buying when you first encountered it and how it happens today.
Sure. I think that there are 6 areas of difference. The first is the background. 50 years ago and plus, the occasion for the contract selling was the Great Migration, second Great Migration from the South between 1940 and 1970. And I know for a fact that there were 12,500 new black home buyers in Chicago alone from 60 to 70. Today, the occasion is the foreclosures as a result of the subprime crisis. And for a period of time, it's now stopped or slowed down. I'm told, was told this morning by Joe Young, who was from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, that the Fannie Mae is no longer selling large blocks of foreclosed homes to investors now, as they did say for several years shortly after the recession. As a result, there are a lot of these homes that are still unsold and abandoned, and they're spread out all over the place. From an organizing standpoint, it was an easier job 50 years ago because you go down a block because of the way it crept through the speculators trying to control the market and going block by block and sending a black woman with a baby buggy down the street to scare people, saying the blacks are coming. We would have 12, 15 contract buyers on a block as we were knocking on doors 50 years ago. Now they're spread all over the place. They're not that far apart, but you don't have the same concentration, and it's not as easy to identify them. As a matter of fact, on New Year's Eve, I remember going around, I had my first list of what I thought were contract buyers, and the first place I came to was a vacant lot, and the second place I came to was an abandoned building. There are so many of these places that are abandoned or deteriorated or demolished, et cetera, et cetera. So the difference of the occasion makes it a different kind of problem. The second is the buyers. The buyers essentially were the same. 50 years ago, we were dealing with buyers who were middle class, had middle class jobs, middle class incomes, middle class values, and middle class concerns like good education for their kids, home ownership, et cetera, and they were not able to enjoy the middle class values or the benefits of being middle class because we stole from them the opportunity to enjoy the benefits of subscribing to American middle class values. The third thing was the sellers. 50 years ago, the sellers were mostly mom and pop operators, and they were big and they did a job, but they were small operators compared to what they are today. Today, they're Wall Street type investors. Some of them are former Goldman Sachs employees, et cetera. And so the people who were instrumental in creating the recession that we had experienced just before that. The fourth thing is the value. In the packet that, there's a stapled packet that you have, the last page of it has two sides. The one side is the sheet that we did 50 years ago on the basis of the first research we did on the west side between Independence Boulevard and Pulaski Road, and then from the north of Flournoy to the south of Arlington. We didn't include every transaction in there. We wanted to limit it to 20, but it was very clear from that the price that the seller paid was basically market value or slightly below, and the average contract buyer was charged $10,000 above that. And then because they were paying interest on an additional $10,000 over the 20-year life of a contract, which was all they could get back then because they were only doing 20-year mortgages back then, was $20,000. But if you look on the back of that page, you're seeing kind of a different story where and it's also true, there's information on this on the 2 pages that are for Karen Edwards' contract and Alicia Conrad's contract. The sellers were buying them for about $5,000 or $10,000 from Fannie Mae or other sellers. They were mostly foreclosed properties, and they were getting them at a bargain price. They're selling them at different prices, but Mrs. Conrad paid $30,000 or $29,000, and Mrs. Edwards paid $50,000. But we don't have any real clear idea of what that is in terms of value. Interestingly enough, the tax bills for both of those are for the ones that are on the 6 or 8 properties that are on that sheet are showing a value much higher than what the contract buyer is paying for it, which is kind of an indication of the thing that has been publicized recently in the newspapers, that the assessed valuation of houses is much higher for black folks. Because I remember in any of the houses that I've owned, the assessed valuation on the estimated value of the property on the tax bill was always much higher or much lower than what the actual value of the house was. Here the situation is the reverse, so that's another issue that obviously has to be dealt with. But then if you look at the appraisals from 3 of the groups, Zillow, Redfin, and Realtor.com, they're all over the place. And on the back there, there's one in Maywood. The seller, I can't remember what the seller paid for it, but I think the buyer paid something like $30,000, and the tax valuation and the other valuations are much higher. And he told me when I was talking to him that he says he had somebody come by and offer him $10,000 for the house. He says, how can I do it? I have to move, I want to move, but I still owe $20,000. So as a matter of fact, I don't see him here, but Rob Rose, who's the executive director of the Cook County Land Bank, was telling me recently in a meeting that we had that one of the hardest things to do is to put what the real value of these properties is. So that value question is a much harder thing to deal with today than it was 50 years ago. The primary detrimental impact 50 years ago, there's a sheet in your handouts also that has a list of the predatory components of contracts. But what we thought the most detrimental one was the inflated sales price and the amount of money that ended up stealing from the African American community. As Beryl pointed out, her father estimated it was $1 million a day. And then finally, today the detrimental impact is not only the hardship and the condition of the houses that are being sold, which are much worse than the conditions of the houses being sold 50 years ago. For contracts today are designed in such a way that they're designed to fail. As a matter of fact, somebody recently told me they were at a meeting of a group of investors, and somebody was trying to sell the idea of pushing contracts, and they said these are great because they're designed to fail. And as a matter of fact, Mrs. Edwards here has one of those contracts that when she gets to the end of her contract, which is March of 2018, she'll owe $27,000 on her house, and unless she comes up with $27,000, she's out of there. And she had no idea that was part of the situation. They told her she had a mortgage, et cetera, et cetera. So there's that. Plus, there's blight to the neighborhood. When I was going around on New Year's Eve, I came across a house that had a screen door that was hanging on one hinge, garbage all over the place, broken windows, et cetera, et cetera. Then the third thing, so they're just contributing to blight. They don't do anything about it. The cities or the municipalities have to come in and they clean up the messes, or they demolish the properties. There are liens against the property, but these buyers, these investors, just let the property sit and go and be sold, and they don't pay taxes on them. They sell them in a tax sale, so that again, they're causing harm to the. And in terms of strategic considerations, it was pretty easy to come up with a payment strike ultimately. And then one of the things that was beautiful about the payment strike was that instead of just withholding the money, the contract buyers didn't want the public to think that they weren't willing to pay. It was just that they weren't willing to pay the seller. And so in order to prove that, they made out money orders to themselves every single month in the amount of their monthly payment, brought it into the CBL office, and it was put into a safety deposit box rather than a bank, so that the courts couldn't get their hands on it and force the repayment. And as it turned out, that resulted in the renegotiation of 450 contracts of old homes, and then a new home builder who had built homes on the south side, 1,300 of them, evicted everybody. And when I asked people how they felt about it, they said, well, by the time we got evicted, we had saved $6,000, $8,000, $10,000, so we just went out and bought better homes.
That's great.
Anyway, the strategic considerations for today are more difficult to come upon, but we have some of them. And if there's a lawyer in the room who wants to do a big favor for Karen Edwards, she's got an issue coming up next March that needs somebody to go to battle for.
Thanks, Jack. So as I was listening to Beryl talk, and after hearing your story, Karen, there were echoes throughout. So as Jack stated, you didn't know that you were not signing a mortgage.
No.
Okay.
When I went into the office, when I met up with, his name is Manny. He works for URB. he explained to me that you need to have a $5,000 deposit down on the house. At that time, I was off work. Tax time was just coming around. I'm trying to pay for a divorce and move expenses, putting the dogs in the kennel, putting the cats in the kennel, going back and forth to the hospital, trying to check on my mom, taking care of myself at the same time. I eventually ended up getting down to the office. It was about a week before I actually moved into the home. I get into the office. I gave Manny $2,000 in cash. They wrote a receipt out for that. It was 3 days after that income tax check had came to the house and everything. From that check, I took $3,000 from that check. So that'd been a total of $5,000 down. I met Manny at the currency exchange because I had to meet him somewhere in order to give him the rest of the money. At that time, Manny went in his briefcase, pulled a sheet of paper out, ripped the sheet of paper out in half, signed his name to it, URB's name to it, and amount of the receipt. Now that was actually the receipt. I have that all in my bag over there. I'm not even gonna worry about that. So after we did that, I was able to get the key to the house. I got the keys to the house. It was March the 1st, 2013 at 9 o'clock at night. Pardon the expression, it was cold as hell outside. Get to the house. There's no heat in the house. When you walk in, you can see your breath in the room. Now, when you first walked in, let me back up a little bit. I had gone out to see the house, and it wasn't as cold as it was outside when I first saw the house. We walked around the inside of the house and everything. Everything was freshly painted, freshly varnished floors because you can smell all this in the air. So I'm going on their good faith word saying that everything is brand new, everything is painted perfectly, everything. I do the walkthrough through the house. I'm looking through the bedroom doors. All the bedrooms are nicely done, freshly painted, freshly varnished floors, everything. Go in the bathroom, all the fixtures are there. Everything looks picture perfect from the outside. I go into the rest of the part of the house. There's a breezeway in the house. We go to the breezeway, you go down a set of stairs to the left. There's a door there. You go through the door to the opposite side of the house. The house is a double-wide brick bungalow. Mind you now, the house is built in the late 1920s. So, get inside the house, on the opposite side of the house, turn the lights on. It is totally unfinished. Totally. The walls have bullet holes in them. The ceiling has bullet holes in them. The flooring down, there's sections of wood missing where the floors used to be. There's dirt all on the floor and everything. You walk a little further through the opposite side of the house. They were trying to make a bathroom back there, like a small powder room, kind of like a bathroom. There's a hole in the floor where the toilet is supposed to go. There's a little window on the side of the wall here where I guess it's supposed to be a window so you can look out while you go to the bathroom. I don't know.
This is after you signed and got the keys in.
This is before I got the keys.
Okay.
This is the first initial walkthrough. So we go downstairs, and it's totally unfinished downstairs. So I said, okay. So then I just start asking questions. I'm like, okay, so are you going to finish the opposite side of the house? They said, yes. Found out that was a lie. Go downstairs. I asked them, I said, well, what about the basement area? They said, well, we're going to finish all that before you move in. I was like, okay. I go upstairs to the attic. The attic is an unfinished attic, but it's a pitched attic. So when you walk through the attic, you can see the total outside from the side of the house. You know, where all the squirrels can come in, raccoons and everything can come in. So by me being in a difficult place in my life, I can't live with my family because the family does not want to have dogs or cats in their homes. And you think that your family is there for you. My family was not there for me at all. I'm going through a divorce, everything. They're just not there. So, but I come from a Christian-backed family. And they say it's supposed to be, your family is supposed to be there for you no matter what you're going through or anything. Trust and believe that is not so. Because my family just kicked me to the curb. We talk about my aunts and uncles that I grew up with and everything. that didn't matter to them. So, saying that, my back was against the wall. I had to find some place to move into. And this is what I ended up moving to, right there on 85th and Exchange. Where a house where a couple months after that, after moving in, find out that the boiler, which I know nothing about a boiler, the house runs on the boiler system. The radiators did not have enough water in them to even heat up the whole house. So I had to go out and buy heaters, money out of my pocket to buy heaters for each one of the rooms in the house to keep the house warm. I had to turn on the oven and the jets above the top part of the oven to keep the whole house warm. Meanwhile, my mom couldn't go live with her sisters because they didn't want the responsibility of my mom being at their home because she's just getting out of the hospital. So she was back at the house with me. So now I have my mother who just getting out of the hospital and everything at the house with me, trying to keep her warm, trying to keep myself warm. The paint started peeling off the ceiling, off the walls. Mold started showing up everywhere in the house. I called URB on the phone when it happened. They told me, and these are the exact words, we can't do anything for you right now. You have to find a handyman. And I said, I just moved to the neighborhood. I don't know anybody over here. They told me, well, Miss Edwards, it's on you. It's your problem now. I said, okay. Hung the phone talking to them. I sat down, I said, I need to pull myself together. Couldn't find anybody. So this went on back and forth for a good while with URB, trying to get them to come out to the house to show me how to do the boiler, how to get the heat regulated. They wouldn't do anything for me. Everything was my responsibility now. But yet and still, you're still taking my money every month. Then they told me I had to get homeowners insurance. I called every place that there was to be called to get homeowners insurance. No one wanted to give me homeowners insurance. They came out to the house to do a walkthrough. As soon as they saw the opposite side of the house, pardon my expression, they said, hell no. We can't give you insurance for anything. Not the front part of the house, not the back part of the house. Because you live in an area where there's crime. The back part of your house has bullet holes in the ceiling, bullet holes in the wall. We can't do anything for you. So I said, okay. After being turned down by several insurance people, I said, well, let me call URB, my wonderful people, to see what they can do for me. They said, well, we're going to have to give you some forced homeowners insurance. The forced homeowners insurance is $300 a month, not including paying my mortgage, which is $750 a month. So I had to pay homeowners insurance, mortgage, phone, light, gas, property taxes. The taxes, I had to go back and forth with City Hall on so many occasions to get the tax papers put into my name. URB refused to do that. They kept changing the paperwork back to them. And I said, why are you all constantly doing this? And they said, because you are not the homeowner. And I said, what the hell are you talking about? I'm not the homeowner. They said, well, until you pay us your very last dollar, then you don't get any kind of paperwork. You don't get any paperwork saying that the taxes are in your name, the water bill is in your name. I'm not getting credit for anything. I'm paying the money, but not getting any credit for property taxes, for paying water bills, or anything.
Can you talk about the challenges you face with getting repairmen to come out to your home?
Oh my God. Getting anyone to come out to my home to do anything was a nightmare. When I say a nightmare, I mean a nightmare. The first thing they ask you is, are you the home owner? I told them no. They said, well, until you become a homeowner, then we can come out and do something for you. I had to get $5,000 together of my hard-earned money. I'm a healthcare worker. I don't make that kind of money. I make $10.25 an hour. I have to work 7 days a week, 12 hours a day, in order to make a decent paycheck. My mom lives with me and myself. She doesn't, when she gets, I'm sorry, she's on SSI. SSI don't pay you nothing. So I had to pay for her medical and everything else as well, stuff for myself. Getting back to the window situation. I had to pay $5,000 out of my pocket to get windows put in my living room, my dining room, the bedrooms, and that did not even include any doors or the rest of the house getting windows or doors put in. $5,000 is a lot of money coming out of someone's pocket who does not make a lot of money. And when Menards came out, they did the work and everything. And then when they found out that I was not the homeowner, I was no longer able to get in contact with Menards for anything. The windows got a crack in them. Someone threw a BB through the window or something, and the window just started cracking. These are thermoglass insulated windows. And when I called Menards to come back out to the house to replace the windows, they said, well, you're not the homeowner, we can't talk to you. I said, but you took my money, but you can't help me with anything. And they said, no. And that was the last time I heard from Menards. So.
Wow. And then there were a series of other repairs that you had to make to the house as well, in addition to the insurance that you had to pay. You shared how much you pay in each month, $750 plus the $300.
Yes.
Right? And Jack took a look at your contract earlier this week. And Jack, do you remember the breakout of her payments?
I do. It's a rather unusual one. By the way, I should tell you that I've looked at a lot of contracts, and I think that this is the worst one I've ever seen. The $750 payment is broken down so that $300 is paid against principal. The $450 is interest only, and so the $450 a month amounts to 12% interest on $45,000. She's not getting any reduction by reducing the principal on the interest. So the interest rate keeps going up each month. And then, of course, the balloon at the end. Also, just to keep everything out in the open here, the land contract is between Illinois Land Investment, Inc., which is somehow related to URB or another organization, not-for-profit, URF, Urban Relief Foundation, which is located just a couple of blocks from the Tui and Cicero location that Illinois Land contract is.
Thank you. So we've got about 5 minutes left. But Karen, there are a lot of people in this room, and some people live streaming, are watching the live stream. If they can take away one thing from your experience, what would that one thing be that you would want them to know?
Oh, there are so many different things. One, had I known what I know now about land contracts and the situation that I got myself into, I would have never gone to URB, never. This situation is a do or die situation. I don't know, in the next 6 months, I'll be living on the street with my mother or whatever. I have no idea. I don't even sleep good at night anymore. It's kind of hard to work because I can't focus on my job. It's a nerve-wracking thing. It's just nerve-wracking. It's get to the point now, I can't even cry. I'm just almost all cried out.
Yeah.
I'm frustrated. I don't know what to do. I don't know how to do it. My back is against the wall. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for sharing. And Jack, so this is the last question for you. We have an audience that is clearly interested in this issue. What can we do? What is our call to action here?
Well, first of all, I already mentioned lawyers. And any of the, I'd be interested in talking with any legal aid foundations or groups that are here, because I think that that's a good way, or one way of dealing with individuals who are currently experiencing problems. The second is through legislation, and it's already been mentioned that Illinois passed a pretty good, not good enough, but a pretty good law on contracts, which the governor signed, and it goes into effect on January 1st of 2018. But I think that we've got to do something in terms of a national situation now. The Uniform Law Commission is considering drafting legislation, and I've been privileged to be a guest on the committee. Can't vote, but can talk. They're probably going to do something about drafting it, but then you've got to get it passed in 50 states. But I was surprised with the number of people from red states that were in agreement with moving this thing forward. So that was sort of encouraging. I think that we got to, and if anybody has any ideas or wants to look into this with us, we got to do something about federal legislation or some kind of action from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which has the ability to regulate, although in the current situation, if they regulate, the question is how long the regulation will last. But the final thing is that in Detroit, two lawyers have a small fund, and they buy up, they're both in the housing thing, they're just several different organizations. But they're using land contracts, they buy up properties and tax sales, make sure that they're livable. They're selling them to mostly black families, but not only black families, all oppressed families, so well under market value, and at 0% interest for 5 years, so that people can establish a credit record. And what occurred to me about that is that, I think we've got to try to form some kind of a new lending entity that would make it possible for to get properties and homes into the hands of people who have been oppressed for God knows how many years, and at well below market value and at below market interest rates. And so if anybody's interested in helping design that or push through on that, I'd be really interested in talking with them.
Great, thank you. We have a few minutes for questions.
This question is directed to both Mr. McNamara and Ms. Edwards. Clearly, in the phenomenon that the previous speaker spoke about, and in which we're very aware, racially it was a black-white issue. Ms. Edwards, you said your next-door neighbor told you about URB. Can you explain, would you tell us about the racial composition of the people that you dealt with in this situation, your neighbor, URB, et cetera? Mr. McNamara, you used the word vulnerable people. So you clearly didn't say black, white, and you mentioned that red states are very interested, which clearly include a lot of vulnerable people who are not black. How much of the issue today, if at all, is exclusively racial versus vulnerable people?
My next door neighbor, was referring to him, This is when I lived on 102nd in Lafayette. I guess he called himself being a nice guy or something, and I guess he saw the commercial on television, or he knew the guy that worked with URB, and told me, well, you need to call him on the phone and talk with Manny. Manny can help you out in your situation. So when he told me that, like I said, my back was against the wall.
What was his race? That was the one.
Manny is Hispanic. My next door neighbor was Afro-American.
That's
So,
and Mr. McNamee.
I think that, well, I know that the primary target is African Americans. In fact, it doesn't take much living in this country just to know that the people who are treated the worst of all the minorities are African Americans, and the ones who are hated the most by the dominant culture are African Americans. On the other hand, contract selling hasn't been limited to African Americans, but they've been the group that has been most targeted and suffered the most because of it. If you look at numbers comparing different groups during the recession and then during with contract selling, the most targeted and the most exploited are African Americans, then you have Latinos, and then you have Asians in that order. But and back in the days of Upton Sinclair, when he was writing about Back of the Yards, there was a section in that book about Lithuanians being mishandled because of or with contracts.
Thank you. There's another.
This is maybe a naive question from a non-lawyer, but the contracts, especially under current contract law, because they've been so misrepresented, how are they even legal to begin with? And what can we look to when we're talking to attorneys or others in the legal field to kind of shed more light on this in that sense?
Well, first of all, most of our laws are the result of a lot of pressure from different kinds of lobbyists, all of whom are representing the dominant culture, or most of them representing the dominant culture. With rental law, a lot had been done. For example, a landlord has to make sure that repairs are done. He's responsible for the repairs. The landlord is responsible for paying real estate taxes, et cetera. One of the reasons a lot of these landowners or property owners want to sell on contract is because they can load the repairs on the buyer, and they can load the real estate taxes on the buyer. And one of the objections that was raised during the course of the Illinois legislation by the Illinois Rental Property Owners Association was, can you imagine that the contract seller would have to be responsible for the repairs? So like when Mrs. Conrad moved into her house, there was no furnace, there was no hot water heater, the powder room had no sink and no toilets, and the copper piping had been taken out, et cetera, et cetera. So just in order to be able to live there, she had to spend a load of money. And what I'm saying is that so much of the way the laws are framed, for example, one of the laws that we were able to get changed during the Contract Buyers League days was the Illinois Forcible Entry and Detainer Act only required that a landlord or contract seller prove that the person the buyer or the renter was behind in their payment, and no defenses could be raised. And this kind of shocked me because I thought that everybody was entitled to a defense, et cetera, and all that. On top of it, people were saying, why don't, in the 60s, you know, why don't black folks go to the courts for justice instead of rioting in the streets? And the fact of the matter was that they couldn't get justice in the courts, partially because of judges and partially because of the way the laws were written. And we were able to, and then if they wanted to appeal those cases, any individual would have to put up a year's payments in order to be able to make the appeal. And the way we were able to get that done was that the Jesuits across the country put up $250,000 for an appeal bond, and we were able to get the that law changed so that since 1970 or something like that, people can at least raise defenses. And I might add that yesterday afternoon I was waiting at the bus stop at Sheridan and Kenmore, and sitting in the shelter that they have for bus people, and there was an ad put out by the city on the wall of that shelter, and it was white at the top with a broken line and then yellow at the bottom, and in the white section, in very faint colors, it said something to the effect that justice is only for those who can afford it, or something of that sort. And I got to go back and check it because it really irritated me.
So we've got time for two more questions. You here in the front?
I've got one right here, Karenina.
Oh.
And then we'll run it back around.
Three questions?
I also,
Three questions.
did you count two over there?
I counted two. One,
Okay,
two, three.
we'll move it along. But I do want to acknowledge Miss Alicia Conrad, who just came straight from work. Thank you for being here.
So I first want to say thank you, Karen, for your courage and for sharing your story with all of us. I know that is probably one of the hardest things that you can do, but I know that you're doing it because you're trying to create change, not just for yourself, but for everybody. And I think you did an amazing job. And so to you, Karen, and to Jack and to Alicia, I think that, you know, taking lessons from what happened 50 years ago, Jack, as kind of the lead organizer of the Contract Buyers League, you talked a little bit about the difference in the landscape from an organizing perspective. And so I'm curious to know what the organizing strategy is now to address kind of the similar remedies that you sought back in the 50s and the 60s.
Well, I think we need more people involved. I had thought or have been thinking of trying to get college students, since we did pretty well with college students all the way through the contract buyers. We had every semester we had 6 at least college students, and all of them stayed for a period of 6 months, so over a summer and a semester. And they were able to get credit for doing it. I know the University of Michigan has a program called the Semester in Detroit, which I'm looking into, because I would be hoping that we could start something here, which would be a semester in Englewood, or a semester in North Lawndale, or a semester in Austin, with students, because it was college students that did all that research that got this thing going in the first place. And we need a lot of college-type research done. For example, when Ta-Nehisi Coates was doing the article on reparations for The Atlantic, he was trying to link the contract selling with the violence that's in Chicago today. And he didn't put anything in the article about that because we didn't have the research to back it up. On the other hand, it seems to me that one good research project would be to get a sociologist, a psychologist, an economist to all do a study on linking the contract selling and other forms of exploitation, legalized stealing, you might say, from the African American community to the violence that is existing today.
Hi, my name is Richard Wheelock. I'm the Director of Advocacy at LAF, formerly known as Legal Assistance Foundation. To answer the question, young woman who asked, the situation that's described, there are legal remedies when there's outright fraud for undoing these contracts. So let's just be clear on that. And our agency does a lot of work on that in the foreclosure defense area, and certainly for these land sales contracts. So that's why we're very interested and we're present. I know the Chicago Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under the Laws is also very interested, and there are other legal aid organizations in the city that can represent individual victims. So I just want to put that out there to let people know. I know there's new legislation that has been passed, so sometimes there are remedies available in undoing some of these contracts. So, of course, there's a lot of organizing and legislative activity that still can be done, but I wanted to make sure that people understood that there are legal resources available for people who are victims of outright fraud where misrepresentations have been made. Thank you.
We have 1 minute left. Please.
Thanks. Thank you, guys. I had a question actually about property taxes, because the packet that was provided, right, shows that the on the last page it shows that the property taxes are based on kind of higher prices than the sellers bought them for. And so I'm wondering, in these land contracts, who is responsible for paying the property taxes, and what role does that play in compounding the issue of the contract? Because it seems like you've got the burden of paying the property taxes, but then you're being overtaxed because the property is being overvalued.
Go ahead.
What happens is that sorry, talk loud anyway. What happens is that we give them our taxes. We're supposed to, actually, and what happens is that they're supposed to pay the taxes from the money that we give them. So what has happened in my case, the taxes went up, so they had to start charging me more. So they sent me a letter saying that this is what they were going to do. But that's how the taxes are supposed to get paid, because if they don't pay them, then gee willikers, we're out.
I just want to say something also. When I acquired the house in 2013, I was there only one day, which was it was March the 2nd. URB sent me a letter in the mail stating that I owed taxes for 2012. What? I called them back on the phone and said, you all know good and par expression damn well I didn't even live in this house in 2012.
They had stuck it in the contract, by the way.
Mm-hmm. I had to give up $3,000 for something that I did not even live in, go down to City Hall, hand them $3,000 in cash because URB put the taxes in auction. So in order for me to even save the house, when I first walked into the house, I had to give $3,000. And they are some serious vultures. I cannot describe them any more than vultures. That's all I can describe them as.
So I want to thank all of you. We're out of time, and I'm sure you could just talk for hours about this. But I want to thank you all three for joining us this morning, for sharing your stories, Jack for sharing your wisdom.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask our next and final set of panelists to please come up. And I would also like to just say to the gentleman from the legal fund, I didn't get the name of it, LAF, please, please, please make sure that you leave some information behind before you go. You can find anyone here at MPC or obviously one of the homeowners, and if any of you have resources, please feel free to grab one of us before you go so we can make sure we can share this information. So with that, I'd like to call up our final panel, which is going to be moderated by Deborah Bennett from the Polk Brothers Foundation. She'll be joined by Matt Cole from Neighborhood Housing Services of Chicago, Jae-Young Jung from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, Sharon Lagenza from Housing Action Illinois, and Karen Yarbrough, the Cook County Recorder of Deeds. Please welcome them.
Still on, right? So I have been handing these out too, but since I'm going to go over it. I said, here, I like Jay-Young this one. Good morning. So those first two panels make me want to holler, but this panel is focused on solutions, and it does give me some hope. So while we don't really have good data about the prevalence of contract buying in Chicago today, we do know the conditions that enable it to proliferate. These include housing values under $100,000 and very few mortgage products available for loans under $100,000. According to the DePaul Institute for Housing Studies, more than half of the residential properties on the south and west sides of Chicago, which were very hard hit and is still recovering from the subprime mortgage crisis as well as the foreclosure crisis, more than half of those properties sold for less than $100,000 in 2015. So the conditions for exploitation are ripe yet again. So our panel is focused on solutions from various vantage points. Jae-Young Jung will speak from the federal level. Sharon Lagenza, Executive Director of Housing Action Illinois, will speak from about recent state efforts. Karen Yarbrough, Cook County Recorder of Deeds, will speak from the county perspective. And finally, Matt Cole, who's a program and grant administrator from Neighborhood Housing Services and who is partly responsible for the exhibit in the lobby, will give us a non-governmental perspective. So, Jay?
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much first, Marina, for inviting the CFPB to come today. I think you met Patrice Ficklin, the director of my office, Office of Fair Lending, back in an event in Boston and began the conversation. And so thank you for including us in this. And so I'm from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and many of you probably have heard of the CFPB, but some of you probably have not. So I'm just going to give just a general overview just so you all know what this agency is all about. It is a federal agency. It's the newest one. It was created by the Dodd-Frank Act in 2010. It was the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform Act after the mortgage crisis. And it's specifically in the Dodd-Frank Act. It is a consumer protection statute. And it's an agency that has multiple consumer protection statutes and regulations. And I'm from the Office of Fair Lending within the CFPB. And the Dodd-Frank Act specifically created the Office of Fair Lending because they wanted fair lending to be included and specifically called out to ensure fair, equitable, and non-discriminatory access to credit for consumers. So the Office of Fair Lending, we enforce two of the many statutes that the entire Bureau enforces, but our office is dedicated to HMDA, which one of the moderators in the first panel discussed, the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, And the second statute is ECOA, Equal Credit Opportunity Act, and that deals with discrimination in credit to consumers. So those are the two statutes that my office addresses. So the Office of Fair Lending, just to give a little overview, we have a horizontal function. And what that means is that within the Bureau, you may have heard our office has an RMR, which is research, markets, regulations. So within our Bureau, we have these kind of dedicated folks doing all this market research, statisticians, PhD economists, and folks who write regulations as well. We also have a very large consumer response. We've gathered over the last 6 years that we've been in existence over 12 million complaints and portals through consumers and individuals who file complaints on behalf of those consumers. And then we have a division that is the CEFL division, Supervision, Enforcement, and Fair Lending. And so that includes kind of large bank examination and supervision, and it also includes enforcement actions, public enforcement actions, and then Fair Lending is my office that does both of those. We kind of straddle both of those. We do supervision and enforcement. I'm in the San Francisco office as the West Region Fair Lending Council. We have a regional council in all of our 4 regions. Sam Miller is the one for Midwest here in Chicago. He was going to try to join, but I don't see him in here. But if he does, I'll introduce you all. So so that is the Office of Fair Lending, and our office, in addition to the supervision and enforcement regulations, and we do outreach where we do reach out and work for compliance and education with the private industry, civil rights groups, community groups, other consumer advocates. We publish guidance and bulletins, blog posts, annual reports. You've probably seen some of the recent ones that we issued regarding the work that our office specifically does. And we also have a publication that's I think it's quarterly. It's called Supervisory Highlights. And that is actually a summary of the work that we do that we're finding with the bank examinations. It anonymizes who or what entity is at issue, but it puts out into the public, both industry and consumers and advocates, to know what kind of changes that, what kind of issues we're finding, what changes we've required, and things of that nature. The public enforcement actions obviously are public, so you see those. And I can go into more of those later, but out of time, I'm going to skip over those, but happy to talk to anyone about those. We also do interagency coordination. So we work with the FDIC, the Federal Reserve Board, OCC, NCUA, HUD, FTC, and DOJ, of course. So we have many priorities within the Office of Fair Lending, and those priorities are in the areas of redlining. And again, we've had some recent public enforcement actions regarding redlining in the Northeast region recently. And so we do redlining, and we also have been doing work around limited English proficiency and looking at consumers with limited English access and limited English proficiency and their access to credit. Obviously, another important issue that we're looking at is in the area of contracts for deed. And I think other folks have talked about the different names that it comes under. It's retail installment contracts, land contracts, lease with an option to pay, that type of thing. So as many have already discussed, it is a contract, is a seller finance property sale. Not all homeowners can go to a mortgage company to get a loan. Sometimes the seller of the property offers the buyer a contract for deed or a land sale contract. This type of seller financing may seem attractive to some consumers because there's usually little or no application process. Buyers who don't have the best credit can get a loan. The down payment may be lower, and often the buyer can move right in. But this type of financing has far fewer protections than traditional mortgages. Under a contract for deed, legal title to a home passes to the buyer from the seller only after the last payment is made and all of the provisions of the contract are satisfied. For example, under such a contract, the consumer might agree to make a down payment, make monthly payments on the purchase price over a 30-year period or another term, including interest, repair and maintain the property, and pay all taxes and assessments, among other things. The seller only agrees to deliver a deed upon the consumer's last payment, assuming all of the other provisions of the contract are met. The contracts may also have a provision stating that if the consumer misses a payment or otherwise defaults under the contract, then the seller may declare the contract terminated or choose to convert the contract into a tenancy agreement, keep all the consumer's payments as liquidated damages, evict the consumer without going through a foreclosure process. Some states may require a judicial foreclosure process, and then resell the property again. Some contracts might provide that a seller may enforce a promissory note or a debt obligation for the full purchase price of the contract that originally the purchaser signed. The contracts have become more prevalent throughout the country recently, and a large number of these homes' purchase price is less than $50,000 or $100,000. So the last available data from the U.S. Census Bureau's American Housing Survey, it's dated, it's from 2009, which is the last time they actually asked this question, but they pegged the number of Americans that have entered into contracts for deed at 3.5 million, and that was back in 2009. In the wake of the financial crisis, though, the contracts for deed and other similar seller financing arrangements have had a resurgence. The foreclosure crisis created a bountiful supply of cheap, often dilapidated homes for investors to buy and left millions of people with damaged credit histories. Hundreds of these homes are uninhabitable and need plumbing, electrical, structural, and roofing repairs, and or have pre-existing code violations. In many cases, these homes are being sold to borrowers, often minority borrowers and or in minority neighborhoods, without the proper consumer safeguards and disclosures. Some of these safeguards or disclosures might have included an appraisal, an inspection report, an inspection report of the property, notice of who bears responsibility of the repairs, taxes and insurance, an amortization schedule before closing, title inspection, and right to annual or periodic statements. The Bureau is very aware of the concerns with these transactions. These transactions must be made in compliance with federal consumer financial law. This includes not making deceptive representations in violation of the law. It also includes not engaging practices targeted to minority communities and or people of color in violation of the law. Some of you, I think, asked questions earlier. There was a case filed in the Federal District Court of Michigan. It was a petition in the United States District Court to enforce a civil investigative demand against a few entities who use contracts for deeds. And the civil investigative demand is basically a subpoena. And so we had to move in federal court in Michigan to enforce that subpoena. And that was filed in November 2016. It was, and the CIDs, the subpoenas, were actually issued to the entities in September. We had to move in November to enforce those, and our petition was granted by that federal district court in February of 2017. So I know that our time is limited, so I'm going to stop there, and I'll join my colleagues over there, and then I'm happy to take any questions after.
We're going to go through all of the presentations, and then we'll have questions. Sharon.
Okay. Well, good morning, and thank you again for having us, Housing Action Illinois, here on this panel. We're really excited to be here and kind of kicking off the public education portion of this new state legislation. Briefly, for those who don't know, Housing Action Illinois, we're a statewide coalition with over 160 non-for-profit organizations who've joined us to do a wide variety of activities, including policy advocacy, public education and organizing, and then we also do capacity building, trainings, and technical assistance. So this is, I almost feel like I'm going to go up to the panel, but I'm okay. So because of a limited time, we went ahead and created kind of last minute this flyer, which details provisions of the new law. And I'm just going to go briefly over it so that, because I know, again, we're time sensitive. So what ended up happening, I want to do a little bit of getting into how this law came about. Like many of you, we were beginning to see national and local reports of a resurgence of installment land contracts or contracts for deed. And one of the things we do when we start to hear of issues that are affecting low-income households and communities of color is we try to figure out, well, what's going on in Illinois? Is there something that we might be able to do from a public policy perspective to address this situation? So we reached out to member organizations and other allies around the state, predominantly housing counseling agencies and public legal services organizations, to see what were they seeing in their communities. And we got a response back that, yeah, it was a problem, and we should try to figure out if there was something we could do. So based on that, and reaching out to a wide variety of allies in the room, and I wanted to point out Bob Palmer from our office is here, and he helped draft and negotiate the legislation. And I don't know whether anyone is here from the Illinois Attorney General's office, because they played a key role in this as well. But we were able to draft legislation, and Senator Kaler from Peoria became our chief sponsor. Opposition to the bill, because oftentimes there will be opposition, came from the Rental Property Managers Association and the Illinois Realtors Association. So when that happens, yes, oftentimes when we're trying to push or advance kind of equitable housing legislation, those are the parties that we have to deal with. And their interests are well heard in Springfield. So, so when we say that, it's not insignificant potential opposition. So what this new law does is the bill, which is now, it was Senate Bill 885, but now it's Public Act 100-0416, Installment Sales Contract Act. So it becomes effective January 1st, 2018. One thing I wanted to make clear, though, is it does not have a retroactive effect. So if people had entered into contract for deed agreements on December 25th, this law does not cover those deeds. So one of the things that it requires a written contract, and the contracts must include certain information, like whether or not a balloon payment will be due. It requires the buyer to receive an amortization schedule prior to closing, and this amortization schedule has to break down how much will be going to principal and interest and how much will be going elsewhere. Including, in terms of the information, is how long will it take to pay off the loan. It requires disclosure of building code violations and fair cash value as reflected on tax bills, so that the buyer may have some idea of the conditions and the tax burden. But as we noted, sometimes that is quite challenging to figure out the appraisal value, the fair market value of property these days, but that was somewhat of a proxy. So the way that we looked at this bill is kind of breaking it out into disclosures and education, then protections, and then enforcement, right? So one of the other things, to try to stall or get away from high-pressure tactics, there is a 3-day cooling off period before a prospective buyer has to sign the contract. One thing during this period is the Illinois Attorney General's office will be creating an educational brochure talking through some of these terms that the seller must provide to the prospective buyer. And one of the pieces of information in that will be encouraging the prospective buyer to get an appraisal. It'll also encourage prospective buyers to go to a HUD certified housing counseling agency, like what Matt works for, NHS of Chicago, maybe to explore other options and to really fully understand what they're getting into. So the protections after the sale include that there must be a public record by either recording the contract or recording what's called a memorandum of the contract. And I'm going to just move on because I don't know if the Record of Deeds will be addressing what that might look like. But if the seller fails to do this, then there is a right of rescission, which I think is also important. So it protects the prospective buyers if they're looking to eventually get title. The other thing we heard about is if you miss one payment, then you can get evicted right away. Well, the Act now allows a 90-day cure period. So if you happen to be late on 1 month's payment, you have 90 days to cure that default before you can be evicted or foreclosed upon. And then it also bans certain predatory loan terms. So, for example, failure to repair pre-existing conditions or penalties for prepaying the loan. So then in terms of enforcement, so let's say someone gets into a contract for deed and it violates some of these prior provisions I mentioned. Well, the Illinois Attorney General can investigate violations under the Consumer Fraud and Deceptive Business Practices Act and get a cease and desist order, civil penalties, other remedies. But it also allows individuals to bring an act under the Consumer Fraud and Deceptive Business Practices Act for actual damages, injunctive relief, attorney's fees, and costs to the prevailing party. So hopefully our legal services friends in the room will take note of that provision. And then finally, it expands foreclosure protections to this. Previously, the contracts had to, you have had to have been in the contract for 5 years and paid down 20% in order to get foreclosure protections, and the 5 years has been eliminated. You still have to pay in up to 20% to get that protection, but we felt like this started to address some of the inequities in the practices that were happening. So, did you want to wait until next steps?
Yes,
okay.
Yeah. Karen?
Oh, okay. So I'm going to take advantage of the, yes, over here, because I don't want papers flying all over the floor. I'm Karen Yarbrough, and I am the Cook County Recorder of Deeds. Actually, I'll be the last Recorder of Deeds because my office is being consolidated with the clerk's office. However, and it has to be done by 2020. However, while it's going away in name, I can assure you I fight and I will continue to fight for provisions and all the great things that we've done in our office to protect homeowners. Prior to my election as a Recorder of Deeds, I served as a state representative for 12 years in the General Assembly. Prior to that, I was a business owner that included work as a realtor back in the 70s. Seems like a long time ago. So having worked in both the private and public sector and being a landlord actually myself, a housing policymaker in Springfield, I've seen real estate from both sides of the equation. Unfortunately, some of the battles that we've fought over the last 50 years, it's just so amazing to me that here we are again. And I want to say that I'm glad to be here, to be in a room of people who care about this issue. Housing is foundational. I want to say that again. Housing is foundational. And Karen, let me just encourage you. You got the name Karen, and we're resilient, okay? So this too shall pass for you, but thank you for coming and putting a face to this horrible problem. So while I was a state representative in Springfield, I helped to push through some housing legislation, including the anti-predatory lending database. There were some folks who thought we didn't need that. We needed that. Through this work, we put an end to a lot of the abusive lending practices that hurt so many folks. So we worked with people like Bob Palmer. I mean, it's great. Everybody in this room should have white hats on. I mean, you are engaged in, work, good work, God's work, the way I look at it. So we also made dollars available for housing counselors. And I think, in my view, that if we educate people and we have housing counselors available, information is power. And people don't want to look to government all the time to solve their problems. So if they know it for themselves, they can use this information to protect themselves. So we also created the Rental Housing Support Fund and tackled source of income discrimination. Now, you mentioned about working the realtors in Springfield and these apartment owners. I've been there, okay? And usually the legislation that I worked on in Springfield always seemed to attract those people. And they're really something to deal with. Things that you think that would just make common sense to protect people, they're against it. And they have a powerful lobby. Ask anybody who has had to go up against them. They have a powerful lobby. Remember what we're talking about. We're talking about realtors, and I am a realtor. And realtors make their money by doing what? Selling and buying and, contracts and what have you. But you shouldn't have to do business that way. I mean, you really shouldn't. So here we are today. One of our most vital human resources, a key player in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, housing, and we still need to fight. But I'm okay with that. I'm really okay with that. Over the past year, my executive staff and I have been engrossed in reading some books that I thought were important so that they would understand the work that we do in the recorder's office. And one of those books we read was The Mystery of Capital. And it's by this economist, Hernando de Soto. Now, he finds that a public land record with private property ownership is the single biggest factor to the United States' economic success. So having the ability to prove that we own a property and the ability to prove that we've been making payments allows us to then, we could borrow on our equity and we can use that to put our kids through college and we can create generational wealth, okay? Part of this, I mean, everybody here, you gotta know you're not gonna live forever, right? And whatever we've amassed during the course of our time here, we can pass it forward. But we can't pass it forward using these terrible contracts that are made by people who are just predators in our communities. Another book we read, and I am thrilled, haven't met her yet, to meet Burl Satter. Your dad did some phenomenal work, and I'm so glad that you wrote your book. Your book was one of the books that we read also. I had my entire staff to read it. I told them, you need to know about this. It didn't happen so long ago, but maybe you weren't paying attention. And if those people are coming in our office, I want them stopped at the door. Now, can I do that? Legally, I can do whatever I want, okay? And I have some of my staff here. Mario Reed, I'd like him to stand up. Mario does a tremendous job for the recorder's office because he does our outreach on property fraud. You know, when I went into the recorder's office, I found out that you could just do a fraudulent deed and, put your name on somebody else's property and they own it. And try calling the police. Try calling the police and tell them somebody stole your home. They'd laugh you off the phone. So since I've been in the office, we've done a number of different things to make sure that there are protections for homeowners. I'm real concerned about what's happening today. And I'm using this office. Now, we do what we're supposed to do. We record deeds and we do all of those kinds of things. But we have a very strong property fraud department. And this culprit that's just rearing its ugly head again, contract for deed or whatever you want to call it. I've seen it before. When I sold real estate back in the 70s and 80s, I saw it then. And I saw it because people couldn't get mortgages, but they wanted to own homes. And what's wrong with owning a home? I mean, isn't that the American dream? Or at least it used to be. Because contract for deed, in many cases, is the American nightmare. Now, you heard Karen, what she said. Every probably couple of weeks, we have somebody to wander in our office. And thankfully, Mario is an attorney. And when it looks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, we figure it's a duck. And he makes people uncomfortable. He asks them questions that they probably don't want to answer. And he's fully engaged and involved in pulling over the cover. Now, he's worked with Karen. He's worked with her, and part of the reason why she's here today is we were hopeful when you have a face on a problem, it makes it easier. It really does make it easier. And we've had situations where we've had frauds. We got a guy we're chasing right now. It's on the south side of Chicago. You know what he's doing? He's taking, and he's probably in possession of about 130, 150 homes. He doesn't own them. But you see these little pieces of paper, cardboards that are tacked on, I don't know, telephone poles or what have you that say rent to own in their telephone number? Who would even call those numbers? People do it all the time. That guy, those properties, many of them are on a demolition list, for crying out loud. But these unsuspecting people who are looking for a deal, or just, you know, they're desperate. They need a place to live. And these people prey on them, and it's awful. So, you know, while I'm not a legislator anymore, but I probably passed more bills in the last couple of years, I tell you, and working with people like McNamara, he came to my office. I said, yeah, we'll sign on to that bill. We'll help you in whatever way we can, because I still have some friends in Springfield. And when it comes to housing policy, even though I'm not a legislator, I used to chair the housing committee, and I know a lot of people, and I do understand this issue. So I think I'm going to end there, because I'm sure you have some questions for all of us, but just know this is worth fighting for. And even though it's 50 years later, you know, we could have 50 years ago, I guess people said, well, let's solve these other problems. This problem is still here. And for people who are unsuspecting, I know our office is committed to educating people and directing people where they can go for help.
Thank you.
And I believe everybody here is also the same way. You care, and so do I. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, from a non-governmental perspective, Matt Cole.
Morning, everybody. My name is Matt Cole. I work with Neighborhood Housing Services of Chicago. We're a 40-plus-year-old nonprofit housing community development organization, CDFI, working to rebuild Chicago neighborhoods and neighborhoods in the south suburbs through homeownership. We come out of the whole sort of CRA, fair access to credit, equal housing movement that was helped in many ways spawned by Jack and the CBL. So, and in fact, we've had a neighborhood office in Lawndale since 1999, and so this story about the CBL has been very important to us, and thus the exhibit that Blanche put together along with a AmeriCorps Vista that we had named John Wolfe. From our perspective, and I'm going to keep this very brief, we've been on the ground for 40 years in the neighborhoods. And I think most of my colleagues and our president, Kristen Faust, who's in the audience, would agree that we still see many of the structures that have allowed for the type of exploitation that Karen was just talking about, the sort of exploitation of the dream of homeownership, the dream of people for security, of place and rootedness in a neighborhood and building some financial well-being. We're still seeing these structures in place from unequal job access, unequal pay, we're in terms of communities of color, unequal job access, unequal pay, unequal access to credit, rising rents for shoddy apartments, and this combined with a general broad lack of financial literacy across the country creates these opportunities for contract buying to come back. Everything old is new again, right? James Baldwin talks about the fact that history is not past, it is present. We are our history. Or, we're seeing questionable mortgages coming back, and we're seeing, shouty house flips, buff and puff house flips, where someone bought the house really cheap and put a bunch of paint on it and then flip it to an unsuspecting buyer. And for us, the solutions in many ways remain tried and true. They are education and housing counseling, which are now kind of post-foreclosure crisis because everything is happy-go-lucky and good now, right? Everything is all normal in the market. Of course, it's not. But nobody's really. People are saying, "Oh, we don't need as much education or counseling as we did in the past," and that's just not true. Our housing counselors and our frontline outreach staff and our construction specialists, as far as I'm concerned, in NHS, are real heroes, because they're ultimately kind of working on this front line to say, look, we support your dream of wanting to be a homeowner, but let's take a moment and actually make sure that what you're getting into is actually what's right for you. So be it just our general homeownership education classes, where people get sort of like the A to Z understanding of what it means to buy a home, or our financial literacy classes to get people just sort of ready to move on to a better financial situation, to our counseling sessions where people literally get to sit down with a counselor, a HUD-certified counselor, to be like, all right, let's look at this contract that maybe you're thinking about signing for a home, or let's look at these different mortgage options that you have. Let's, make sure that this is right for you. And then if it's not, let's find a better situation, or let's try to get you into a better situation. In the case where people are already struggling, in many cases, our counselors become the front lines as well. So when people need help because they've been subject to mortgage fraud, or they're in foreclosure, or they find themselves in a situation where they've signed a land contract that's exploitive, our staff can be in these positions to try to work with them, connect them with the AG office, connect them with other LAF, other resources, to try to come up with a positive remedy. Because ultimately, keeping people home secure, rather than having that home be vacant and become a blight to the neighborhood, is ultimately better for the community. So what we really think is really needed is just more ways to get people like through the doors of us, or Lucha, or the Urban League, or whoever, to get support and understanding that they need, not to see it as a, oh, this is another step that I have to do, or as a burden, but actually help people once they do see it this way as they get through our doors, as, oh, this is a real resource. This has been very helpful. And I think that's ultimately going to be the biggest part of continuing to try to solve these problems until we can find a better road to a more socially just environment here in the U.S.
Thank you. So my first question is for Jay, actually. How do this newly passed Illinois law, protections at the county level and the housing counseling that Matt just talked about, how does that compare to other jurisdictions that you've seen around the country?
I think it's great that the Illinois bill did pass, and that there are these local kind of protections, because I think that is part of the issue that we're seeing across the country, is that there's scattershot local jurisdiction protections with equitable mortgages or equitable interest and protections, and so there is less of those than we'd like, and so that it's definitely seeing. It helps to obviously to have more of these happen, so that maybe there may be more on a national level.
What we have done in the recorder's office, we passed a law, refer and review law, that allows us to refer a person to an administrative law judge that will allow them to decide whether if a person's title has been clouded or what have you, so that they don't have to take that money out of their own pocket. Normally what happens is, once their title was clouded, then they usually have to hire an attorney, and it may be $2,000 to $5,000 that they'll have to pay to do that. So, and this happened to the former city treasurer. Somebody clouded her title, put their name on her property, and she didn't know anything about it and wondered how in the heck that happened. So having that law on the books is very important. Not to mention that that used to be just a misdemeanor. So we went to Springfield and we asked that most of them be a felony now.
Thank you. Are there any questions from the audience?
One of the statements from the new administration, presidential administration, is that they plan to undo Dodd-Frank. Now, I'm a bank director, so the bank officials are joyous at the possibility. Your office, do you perceive that it's under any threat of dismantling?
I'm just a lowly counsel over in the West region, and so I don't.
I mean the bureau that you work for, not your office
Yeah.
in San Francisco.
Yeah. I can't. I don't. I mean, the threat is. I think there's lots of threats happening, coming from all kinds of sides, and we continue to do our work, and our director has directed us to. We're there for the consumers, and until I'm told otherwise, I'm doing my job. So.
Well, and I would just add from a policy advocacy perspective that, yes, there have been threats against CFPB, defunding it, breaking it apart, pulling its fangs in terms of its ability to really enforce consumer protections and help individuals. Is when we talk about consumer protections, we're talking about helping real people with real problems. And so from a policy advocacy perspective and with a wide network of people, there are efforts to make sure that our federal legislators understand the importance of the CFPB and the importance of a strong enforcement arm there. And they've helped, millions of consumers with billions of dollars in terms of remedies. And so it's very effective. So I would just add that as a piece of, if this is of concern and you want it to continue, speak up.
I'm Dory Rand from Woodstock Institute. Thank you for this forum and this panel. I have a question for Sharon. Congratulations on passing the Installment Sales Contract Act. My question is about the people who are still not covered, and I know what the sausage making is like in Springfield, so this is not a criticism, but I noticed that it doesn't cover contract sellers who make 3 or less of these kinds of bad contracts per year. And I wondered if you have estimates of how many sellers that covers. So is this protecting, 97% of the industry, or who's left, and what are we going to do with them? I guess we still have, as Rich Wheelock said, the fraud protections just from basic contract law, but how many other people are still at risk?
So, and thank you for pointing that out, because that was something that I overlooked, but kind of the definition of a seller, and that's the sellers of 1 to 4 unit residential properties who enter into contracts more than 3 times in any 12-month period. So there is a carve out for smaller sellers, and that came about, and Bob can give you probably the full history, but briefly, when we reached out to allies and members, there were some circumstances where, for example, family members might do such an arrangement, or people with non-traditional credit or in the immigrant communities. And the feedback we received was that this really didn't take into account the really bad stuff that's going on from the URBs or other large-scale entities. And so that's where, I don't have any data, and I don't know, Bob, did we ever pull out any specific numbers along that? Yeah, we don't have numbers on that, but that's kind of some of the motivation behind it, is that we heard from folks who are trying to help groups, like some not-for-profits have some kind of innovative rent-to-own models, and so that's kind of where the carve-out comes from. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, and the realtors. I should say the realtors demanded it, and then we did the check-in. We did the check-in with with the network. But one thing when we think about follow-up, just to use that, is the law though also says that if an entity were to form a variety of LLCs, and each LLC were to form, say, 2 or 3 properties to get around that, they all get rolled up into one entity, right? So they're not going to. So there is that. So because we know that people will think of ways to get around it, and so this is really for the one-off, the two-off kind of seller.
Great. So I think we have 2 questions here, and then Ken first. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm
I'm trying to understand, are all contracts for deeds recorded someplace? It sounds like some of these are just private transactions, right, between two parties. So there's no way to know how many of these are out there. Huh. Thank you.
In the act, it said that before the final review, they removed the language relating to violations of the Residential Mortgage Act. A lot of the things I see as a financial capability coach, they are violations of the Mortgage Act on these contracts. So are you guys gonna go back and try to get them to put the language back in?
I'm sorry, I'm not understanding your question. Can you-
They remove language relating to certain things that contract sales do to people, as they would be considered violations of the 1987 Residential Mortgage Act. But before the final bill was put through, they pulled that out. So I know you said there were powerful lobbies against certain parts of the bill. Are you guys gonna go back and try to get that language put back in where violations on the contract would be considered violations of the federal law?
I'm going to defer to Bob because I'm not sure I'm understanding the scope of your question.
Yeah, I don't understand the question either. I mean, I understand what she's saying, but I don't know what she's.
Well, we're referencing to it.
Maybe we should deal with it after.
Yeah, we're happy to talk back, and if it's something that got inadvertently overlooked, we'll definitely consider it.
So we'll go here next to Blanche.
I just want to say thank you to all of you for accepting the display. It is out of the direct result of unfair housing, contract buying. I am a housing counselor. I am on the front line. The contracts you see in the back were actually given to me, not from people from a long time ago. They're people that allowed me to tell their story. These contracts are still blowing up. That was done in 1970. 1970. A lot of them had promissory notes attached to them. Contract buying is very real. So I just wanted to make that statement. And with us, with Neighborhood Housing Services, who allowed us to do this display, we monitor our clients. When I look at a client, I look at it as insurance, his taxes. I look at that contract, whether it's in the past or the one he did now. So I just wanted to make that statement because a lot of people don't understand that contract buying is very real. Foreclosure is still happening. It has not went away.
Do we have thank you. Was there another question in the back?
Yes, thank you. So I was wondering, under protections after the sale on the summary of the Installment Sales Contract Act, do those protections apply retroactively so that people who have current contracts, do those have to be recorded now even if they were formed 2 years ago?
No, the bill does not have a retroactive effect.
Thanks.
Any other questions?
Hi. Yeah, I just had one question about, so not specifically about contract sellings, but I was curious about what, in response to a lot of the predatory lending practices and barriers to establishing credit and property ownership, can you speak to some other measures against that? I'm specifically thinking about the FHA loan and how that's situated in this ecosystem. No. Yeah, alternatives and what kind of measures are being done now. And I'm just curious where some of those initiatives like FHA loans are situated in a solution space.
Hi, Kristen Faust with NHS. And we are a single-family mortgage lender. I will just say that on the lending side, things are not perfect. But The rules that got put in place by Dodd-Frank and the CFPB have made a world of difference. A world of difference. It is a different place to do business today than it was 10 years ago. So that is really good news. And FHA is a government loan, and it's still there, and it's part of the marketplace, and it serves a need. And then there's loans like ours and loans that the banks offer too. And I'd be happy to talk to you in more detail afterwards.
Okay, there's another one in the back, and then right here.
Does anyone on the panel, or Sharon, do you have any data on, getting down to nuts and bolts in eviction court? How many, what do the numbers look like here, for example, for Cook County, in terms of the rise of evictions that are based on land sale contracts? Is there you would expect there's a trend going up given the dynamics you're talking about, people unable to get, because of the housing crisis and people not being able to get credit. Bob, I don't know if you've seen anyone's run the numbers to see, how many people are being evicted. So that just we have a sense of what the size of the problem.
I don't think we know the data. I think it was the Reader article that said that there were maybe 300 contracts in the Chicago area, but regarding evictions as a result of that, I don't know that we know.
Yeah, I think we're still trying to. So we've been making certainly our staff at NHS aware of this again, and we polled sort of all our homeownership counselors and some of our other staff to see what they're seeing, and they haven't seen much at this point, or really anything for the most part yet. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there's not this sort of iceberg thing going on down below that's going to start trickle up, because, this has really just started to emerge again as many of these properties, these tranches of properties, were sold by Fannie and Freddie and picked up by these large investment companies. So there's still probably some time that we're going to see. Like, the ones that really get reported are the ones that are, incredibly exploitive, so exploitive that, as Jack said, that they were essentially designed to fail, in a way. Where we've seen it, the one or two that I've seen personally in NHS has come through our role as receiver. We serve as the 1 to 4 unit receiver for the city of Chicago, and there has been one or two that have come our way. And particularly, the one that stands out to me was one where we ended up as receiver on it because there was a number of building code violations on it, and we were ultimately appointed because there was this fuzzy ground of who actually owns the building. Is it the person who's living there or who has the contract, or is it the seller who has the obligation? And there was no clear answer to that.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question, Mr. Brown. Yeah.
This has been great. This is obviously an issue that's impacted more people than we probably know and understand, but something that's been in place as an issue for us for a long time, even preceding the crisis, has been the lack of what I would say broad spread, effective consumer education around these kinds of issues. And too often we're in a situation where organizations like NHS can provide lots of great counseling, but you tend not to have the reach to get to the people so that you can inform them of the issues before they go to their neighbor and ask, for advice. In today's world, one thing that has changed since 2009-10 is the expansion of social media. And it makes it both an opportunity and a problem, but to what extent are you really leveraging the new tools to be able to get the word out? Because if you don't, we know that the guys who are making lots of money will do it, and you don't want to be fighting them with old-fashioned tools, techniques, in a modern-day battle for the consumer's mind.
Well, I would just say that you're absolutely right, and that's why the educational piece is so important here. And it's not just about this act, but it's just more broadly around understanding what a mortgage is, understanding student loan debt, understanding anything that's going to affect your financial present and your financial future. One thing, there's an exciting opportunity where through a state fund, we're able to, with housing counseling agencies statewide, increase our marketing and communications. Specifically to address the issue you're talking about is how do consumers really get to know that NHS of Chicago is available, or Lucha or TRP or Navicor in Peoria or wherever it may be, and how do we reach them beforehand? So this initiative just started in this month, and so we're working out kind of what that might look like. Individual agencies will be doing it, but then collectively, we're going to be looking at increased marketing and communications using social media, using templates to educate people about workshops, et cetera. But there's a long way to go because there's not a huge amount of money to do this, and some of the opposition has quite a bit.
In the CFPB website, actually, we have a huge initiative on doing outreach and doing kind of blogs and brochures that make it very simple to talk about know before you owe and what do you need to know about student loan servicing and student loan debt and buying a car. And so all these things that like everyday consumers, tons of paperwork, lots of legalese, but so we have huge efforts on our website. There are brochures that you could download. We have tweets, we have, Facebook page, we have all these. So you're right, we definitely have kind of, we're supposed to be a 21st century federal agency. And so we have folks that are actually very much engaged in using the social media to educate folks about these types of issues. So take a look.
So, thank you. And I really think financial capability training needs to start much younger. We need to start training young people in schools. So I think that's our time. Please join me in thanking our panel.
And please also join me in thanking all of our panelists who've come out today, who've taken time to be here and share their story and to share the important work that you all have been involved in. So I just want to, just as a recap, we've heard a lot today. We've heard from Beryl about really some of the painful history and the legacy of contract buying, what that has left behind, not only in terms of personal wealth, but also what that represents in terms of racial wealth extraction across many communities here in our city, and how we're still dealing with that legacy today in terms of how that has sort of rebirthed in a way through the foreclosure crisis and the opportunities that has presented for bad actors to step back into this world and bring us back to this conversation. I do want us to remember and think about the solutions that we heard talk about today, from homebuyer education and counseling to the numerous pieces of legislation that have passed statewide and also that have come out of the county, the work that the federal government is doing, and also thinking about how can we be evolving our practices and our solution as this process evolves, and thinking about how can we be partnering together using the strategies and the tools that we all bring to this work to think about ways that we can raise awareness and really be supporting some of the efforts downstate as well as here locally in our community. So I want to thank you all for being here. I want to encourage you all to please continue to stay in touch with us, and let's keep this conversation going. Let's think about how we can continue to share some of the resources that you all have raised in this room today. And we want to hear from you, from your ideas about where we can go with this in terms of this issue and raising awareness. So thank you all again for being here and calling attention to this important issue, and we hope to hear from you again soon.
Thanks to MPC.